Chicago. Stretched along the cold shores of Lake Michigan, it's home to almost 3 million. To an estimated 25,000 gangbangers who live here, Chicago represents just one thing: the almighty Latin King and Queen Nation.
They get stronger and stronger. You know, every year they have new recruits. Every year they have new members joining in. It's like a never-ending story.
The story of the Latin Kings begins in the 1940s, when Puerto Ricans and Mexicans fled political upheaval and sought refuge in Chicago. Instead, many Spanish-speaking immigrants found racism.
The one thing that set an impression to me when I was in the United States was the unfairness that was shown blatantly by people in authority towards the people of color.
The immigrants responded by forming what they called social groups, claiming that they strengthened their sense of community. One of those was the Latin Kings.
The Latin Kings was actually formed to protect the people. Back in the days, it was to help secure the neighborhood.
In the 1960s, the Latin Kings found themselves in the thick of the civil rights movement, working to change the system.
They weren't a gang of thugs. They got the people together, they registered them to vote, they pushed for education, for equal rights.
This dream of change didn't last long. The culprit, heroin. The Latin Kings saw there was money to be made from addiction, and the nation took a new course.
The drug trade got introduced into the neighborhood. The easy money and the greed. People were getting killed left and right.
By the early 1970s, the former community group earned a new label as more and more kings got into dealing.
You're fighting, fight might lead to shooting or whatever it might end up being, where now it becomes a street gang.
Two young leaders began to emerge as the gang's ranks swelled. On the south side, it was Raul Gonzalez, a Mexican also known as Baby King, or BK. On the north side, it was a Puerto Rican named Gustavo Colon, known as Gino. Even at the age of 18, he stood out.
He did have that kind of power and that kind of charisma. His stature was that big.
The Chicago PD was noticing Gino as well, for all the wrong reasons. On September 28, 1972, they charged Gino with shooting and killing another teen in the Humboldt Park neighborhood. Gino was convicted of murder and sent to Stateville Prison in Joliet, Illinois, for 30 to 60 years. Once inside, he began to compose a system of intricate laws for the Latin Kings. He called it a constitution.
While he was in prison, he made those codes of conduct and the rules for all the Latin Kings all over. And then they were all spread out to all the nation, to the hoods, and everybody had to abide by those rules.
The code of conduct became the lifeblood of the nation.
Back then, it was straight. You were a Latin King, you had to learn your laws, you had to know what your beliefs were.
Puerto Rican immigrant Raimundo Sanchez was only too willing to follow Gino's rules. The 11-year-old lived in fear of an abusive stepfather and wanted a way out.
I remember he pulled out a 38 snub nose and he put it up my head. He cocked the hammer and my sister and my mother came running and got between the gun, and so he didn't get a chance to shoot me.
His escape was hanging with the Latin Kings in his neighborhood.
They were kids that basically accepted me for who I was, where I was allowed to express myself.
He even tried to sell the Kings the gun his stepfather had pulled on him.
They would buy it basically because they knew I hung out with them. That's going to be the first place the cops come looking for that gun.
In 1975, Raimundo became a Latin King by way of a violation. he joined the hundreds in Chicago who now swore allegiance to the nation. Around that same time, the Kings began to allow women into the gang. They became known as Latin Queens and were expected to be as hardcore as the men.
We used to go out there and beat up people and shoot at people and carry drugs and slang drugs, just like the Latin Kings. It didn't make a difference. We were just female.
15-year-old Sonia Rodriguez, a.k.a. Lady Q, endured a 3-minute beating to join the gang. Before long, she was running her own 6-woman crew.
The Queensmen back in the days were badasses. At the time, I felt like I was on top of the world. I thought I won a gold medal.
Her crew was pushing cocaine and making money.
Back then, it was all about making money and trafficking drugs. That was me. I've never seen so many drugs and money than at the time I was a Latin Queen.
Well, it's like an expansion of a store. If you weren't willing to be violent and fight for that store, then you weren't welcome.
While the gang had other leaders, like BK, Gino was eclipsing them from his prison cell and becoming the face of the Latin Kings. By 1983, he held the title of Corona and was being called Lord Gino by everyone. Lord Gino carried himself like royalty and held court with only a select few.
Lord Gino would only deal with certain amount of people. He would never have direct contact with some of the underlings. He would more or less shield himself from the amount of people who could damage him.
Most accepted Lord Gino's leadership, except for Lady Q. When word got back that Gino's authority was being questioned, he asked her to visit him at Stateville Prison.
This beautiful, handsome man came up to me talking about what you got to say now. And I looked at him, I repeated every word. And ever since that day, he didn't want me to visit nobody. I had to go see him personally. We trusted each other, and there was nothing that I couldn't tell that man.
She became Lord Gino's private liaison and greased the wheels with some of his most important allies, the prison guards.
I used to meet guards on the south side and pay them off, and they used to take a certain amount of drugs into the penitentiaries for us.
Under Lord Gino's guidance, the Kings were taking over Illinois' prisons.
Latin Kings are the ones, they receive all the drugs in the prison system. And if you want any kind of drugs, you have to go through a Latin King.
In 1985, Big T, an enforcer for the Kings, landed in prison on drug charges. His punishment only furthered his business.
I was still holding it down in the prison because I was still a Latin King, and people still feared me in the prison. I was still winning the deck that I was on.
The Latin Kings were growing. Based on the teachings of Lord Gino, the gang exploded into New York and across the country.
Latin Kings are all the same all over. Maybe just a few different rules might change here and there, but it's the same literature, same code of conduct.
Lord Gino seemed invincible, until some say he crossed the line. July 1989, Stateville Prison. Lawrence Cush, a corrections officer, turned up bludgeoned to death with an iron pipe. Cush, a law-abiding officer, had stumbled on the inner workings of the King's drug trade. The prison immediately suspected Lord Gino had ordered the hit.
You're not going to just kill or assault an officer unless it comes from somebody of authority, because there's always repercussions.
The warden ordered stepped-up surveillance on Lord Gino, but the prison never charged him with the crime. Lord Gino was transferred to a correctional center in Pontiac, Illinois, in order to diminish his control of Stateville. The kingdom was under fire, and before long, fractures began to form at even the highest levels.
Gino was the kind of person that he used to say, you keep your friends close, you keep your enemies closer.
You can never put all your trust in nobody, period.